Hey, deep divers, ready for another deep dive? You know how much we love getting into the nitty-gritty of history, and today's topic is especially fascinating. We're talking about the allies of the Black Panther Party.
Ooh, yeah. No, this is going to be good. The Panthers often get portrayed as this lone wolf force, but that's not the whole story.
Not even close. It's like seeing one piece of a puzzle. You need all the other pieces to really get the full picture.
Exactly. And the pieces we're talking about today, those allies, they were essential to the Panthers' impact.
So our mission today is to uncover these alliances, to see who they were, how they worked, and how they helped shape the Black Power movement. It's like a history detective game.
I like that, a history detective game. So where do we start?
Well, to kick things off, let's get the obvious out of the way. The Black Panther Party, they were central to the Black liberation movement, right? But they understood something crucial.
That you can't do it alone.
Exactly. They knew they needed allies to make real change.
And they found them in some pretty unexpected places.
Like the White Panther Party.
Right. You hear that name, and you might do a double take, like White Panthers. What's that all about?
It sounds like a contradiction, right?
At first glance, yeah. But they were deeply committed to the cause.
So how did this even happen?
Well, it actually goes back to Huey Newton, one of the founders of the Black Panther Party. He straight up called for white allies to step up and fight against racism.
And that's how the White Panthers came to be.
Yep. In 1968, they answered that call and got right to work. They organized protests, published radical literature, and really tried to bridge that gap between white radicals and the Black liberation movement.
It must have been a tough position to be in back then, being a white person openly supporting the Black Panthers. That took guts.
It did. They faced a lot of backlash, but they believed in the cause, and they were willing to put themselves on the line for it.
So they were kind of like a bridge between two worlds that didn't always see eye to eye.
Exactly. They helped connect white radicalism with the Black Power movement, which was huge in terms of spreading the message and gaining support.
Sadly, though, the White Panther Party didn't last as long as some other groups.
True, their time was short, but their impact was real. It goes to show that even short-lived alliances can leave a lasting mark.
All right, so we've got the White Panthers. Now let's talk about another fascinating ally, the Red Guard Party.
Now, these folks were something else. They were a Chinese-American revolutionary group operating right there in the heart of San Francisco's Chinatown.
San Francisco in the late 60s. That must have been a hotbed of activism.
Oh, you better believe it. And the Red Guard Party, they were right in the thick of it. They had a lot in common with the Black Panthers, too. Both believed in armed self-defense, fought against capitalist exploitation, and ran similar community programs.
Wait a minute, hold up. They had community programs, too. Like, what kind of programs are we talking about?
You're going to love this. They ran free breakfast programs for kids just like the Panthers.
Seriously? They had free breakfast programs, too? That's amazing. It sounds like such a simple thing, but it must have meant so much to those communities.
Absolutely. It wasn't just about the food. It was a powerful statement. They saw food insecurity as a direct result of inequality, and they were taking action to address it head on.
So it was about empowering the community, showing them that they could take care of their own.
Exactly. It was a way of challenging the system and saying, we're not going to wait for handouts. We're going to create our own solutions.
That's so powerful. And it really highlights how groups facing different forms of oppression can find common ground in those shared struggles.
It's all about recognizing those shared struggles and realizing that you're stronger together.
So we've got white allies, Chinese-American allies. It seems like the Panthers were building a pretty diverse coalition.
You're catching on. They understood that to create real change, they needed to build bridges across racial and ethnic lines.
And speaking of building bridges, that brings us to the Brown Berets.
Ah, the Brown Berets. Now, these were some serious activists. They were a Chicano rights group, and they weren't afraid to get militant.
So they weren't messing around.
Not at all. They were on the front lines fighting police brutality and discrimination, especially in those urban communities where tensions were high.
I bet that resonated with the Panthers. They were dealing with the same issues in Black communities.
Absolutely. And when their goals aligned, they teamed up, especially when it came to protesting police violence.
Man, that's a powerful image. Black Panthers and Brown Berets standing shoulder to shoulder, facing down the same forces.
It's a testament to the power of a united front. When these groups came together, they made a statement that couldn't be ignored.
And that's what solidarity is all about, right?
Solidarity is about more than just showing up at protests, though. It's about sharing strategies and learning from each other.
Speaking of learning, that brings us to another group that was heavily influenced by the Panthers, the Young Lords.
The Young Lords, they were a Puerto Rican nationalist movement that started as a street gang.
Wait, from a street gang to a revolutionary movement.
Mm.
How did that happen?
It's a fascinating story. They transformed themselves from a group focused on turf wars to a political force fighting for social justice.
So what were they fighting for?
Their goals were very much in line with the Panthers. They wanted better healthcare community control and an end to racism.
Sounds familiar, right?
Yeah, and here's where it gets really interesting. The Young Lords didn't just share similar goals, they actually adopted many of the Black Panther strategies. They organized patrols to monitor police activity and created their own community programs, all modeled after the Panthers.
So the Panthers' influence spread far and wide. Their model of community organizing and self-defense, it clearly resonated with other groups fighting similar battles.
It did, and it speaks to the power of their message and the effectiveness of their tactics. They weren't just talking about change, they were making it happen.
But this is a deep dive. So I want to understand more about the why. Why were the Panthers so successful at attracting and inspiring these allies? What was it about them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? Well, part of it was their charisma and their revolutionary zeal. They had this energy, this passion that drew people in. But it was more than just that.
What else was there?
I think it also had to do with the clarity of their message and the effectiveness of their tactics. They weren't just talking about change, they were enacting it. And that resonated with groups who were tired of waiting for justice.
So they were about action, not just words.
Exactly. They walked the walk, and that made all the difference. It's one thing to talk about these groups being allies, right? But it's another to understand how they actually work together. Like, what did that collaboration look like on a day-to-day basis?
Right. It's easy to just list off names, but I want to get into the nitty-gritty. Like, how did these groups actually support each other? Did they just show up at the same protests, or was there something deeper going on?
Oh, it was way more than just showing up at protests. They were in the trenches together, working side by side to make change happen.
Give me an example. What kind of stuff did they do together?
Well, let's look at the Black Panthers and the Young Lords again. They were constantly collaborating, especially when it came to issues like housing and healthcare.
Healthcare, huh? They both had those free clinics, right?
Exactly. Those clinics were a lifeline for their communities. But they didn't stop there. They even occupied a hospital together in New York City.
Wait, they occupied a hospital? What? That's intense.
It was a bold move, for sure. They were demanding better services for their communities, and they weren't afraid to use disruptive tactics to get their point across.
Disruptive is an understatement. I can't even imagine what that must have been like, occupying a hospital. It must have been chaotic.
It was definitely a way to shake things up, and it shows how far they were willing to go to fight for their people.
It definitely makes you realize that these alliances weren't just symbolic. They were about taking real action together, putting their bodies on the line.
Absolutely. They understood that solidarity meant more than just words. It meant putting yourself in the line of fire alongside your allies.
Now, what about groups like the American Indian movement? Their situation seems so different from what was happening in urban communities. How did their collaboration with the Panthers play out?
You got to remember that both the Panthers and AIM were heavily targeted by the FBI's counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO.
Yeah, COINTELPRO. That was a messed up program, straight up. It's chilling to think about the government actively trying to undermine these movements for social justice.
It was a dark chapter in American history, but it also brought these groups closer together.
How so?
Well, they realized they had a common enemy. The government was actively trying to destroy them both. So they started sharing legal resources and strategies for resisting surveillance.
It's like the saying goes, the enemy of my enemy is my friend.
Exactly. But it was more than just convenience. They had a real understanding of each other's struggles, even though those struggles manifested differently in their communities.
Right. They were both fighting against systems of oppression, even if those systems looked different. So they had each other's backs, not just in protest, but also in dealing with this covert government harassment.
Exactly. It's a testament to the power of shared experience. Even negative experiences can forge really strong bonds.
So we've seen how these alliances led to direct action and mutual support against government repression. But were there any examples of these groups working together on more day-to-day, community-level issues?
Oh, absolutely. One of the most striking examples is the collaboration between the Black Panthers and the Red Guard Party in San Francisco.
Those were the groups with the free breakfast programs, right?
You got it. Both groups were deeply committed to serving their communities and addressing the needs of those who were most marginalized.
It's amazing to think about how they pulled that off. Those programs must have been a logistical challenge, especially with everything else they were doing.
It was a testament to their organizational skills and their dedication. They recognized that food insecurity was a major problem in both Black and Chinese American communities, and they joined forces to address it.
Hearing about these programs makes it all so much more real. It wasn't just about lofty ideals, it was about everyday people helping each other survive and thrive.
It was about putting those ideals into action, making a tangible difference in people's lives.
It's fascinating to see how practical needs intersected with revolutionary goals.
And it highlights how alliances can facilitate the sharing of knowledge and resources. The Panthers actually helped the Red Guards set up their own breakfast program. They provided guidance and logistical support.
So it was a two-way street. They weren't just working side by side, they were learning from each other's experiences.
Exactly. The Panthers weren't just dictating terms, they were open to learning and adapting. True alliances involve mutual respect and a willingness to grow together.
All this talk about collaboration really makes you think about how radical this must have seemed at the time. You have all these groups from different backgrounds: Black Panthers, White Panthers, Red Guards, Brown Berets, Young Lords, coming together to challenge the status quo.
It was definitely a radical departure from the norm, but that's what made it so powerful. They were breaking down barriers and building a movement that transcended traditional boundaries.
And the Black Panthers were at the forefront of that movement. But they knew they couldn't do it alone. They needed allies. And they weren't afraid to reach across those boundaries to find them.
It's pretty inspiring to see how they built this diverse coalition, bringing together people from all walks of life.
It's a testament to the power of coalition building, and a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, solidarity can make a real difference.
But it's also important to acknowledge that not all of these alliances were perfect or without their challenges. Some were short-lived, and the Panthers themselves eventually faced intense government repression and disbanded.
That's a good point. I was just thinking it all sounds great in theory. But how effective were these alliances in the long run? Did they actually achieve their goals?
That's a complex question. Social change is a long game, and it rarely follows a straight path. There are setbacks, internal conflicts, and external pressures that can derail even the most well-intentioned movements.
So you're saying that even though some of these alliances might have been temporary, their impact was still significant.
Exactly. They shifted the political landscape, raised awareness of key issues, and inspired a generation of activists. And even though the Panthers themselves are no longer active, their legacy lives on in the movements for social justice that continue today.
It's like planting seeds. Even if some of them don't immediately sprout, they can still take root and eventually blossom. Their impact might not have always been immediate or obvious, but they help change the conversation and lay the groundwork for future progress.
And those seeds of solidarity, of cross-racial and cross-class collaboration, are more important than ever. If we look at the challenges we face today, climate change, economic inequality, systemic racism, it's clear that we need broad-based movements that can unite diverse groups around common goals. We can learn a lot from the Panthers and their allies about the power of building bridges and finding common ground.
Absolutely. No one group can solve these problems alone. We need to learn from the past and build those bridges of solidarity that the Panthers were so adept at creating.
That's where the real power of their legacy lies. It's not just about remembering the past. It's about applying those lessons to the challenges of our present and future.
Well said. I think we've covered a lot of ground here. We've seen how the Black Panthers built a remarkable network of alliances, and how those alliances function in practice, and what lessons we can learn from them today.
And we've only scratched the surface. There's so much more to explore about each of these groups and the complex dynamics of their relationships with the Panthers.
I know, right? It feels like we could do a whole series on this. But for now, I think it's time to wrap up this part of our deep dive. Okay, deep divers, we're back. And, we left you hanging with the big question. Can you or should you build alliances with groups you don't completely agree with? It's a tough one, right? Like, how do you balance staying true to your core beliefs with the need to collaborate to achieve those bigger goals? It's a dilemma a lot of movements face.
For real. It's easy to team up with folks who see eye to eye with you on everything. But the real test of a strong coalition is how you handle those differences. You got to navigate those gray areas. That's where things get interesting.
So how did the Panthers handle this?
The Panthers, they give us some pretty interesting examples. Take their relationship with students for a democratic society, SDS.
SDS. They were mostly white students, right?
Yep. And while they were definitely committed to social justice, they didn't necessarily buy into the Panthers' full revolutionary ideology.
Right. SDS was more about grassroots organizing and participatory democracy. They weren't exactly about picking up arms like some of the Panthers.
Exactly. So how did these two groups find common ground?
Good question. Because on paper, they seem pretty different.
Well, it wasn't always smooth sailing. There were definitely tensions and disagreements, but they found unity in their opposition to the Vietnam War and their commitment to fighting racism.
So they focused on those shared goals even if their approaches differed.
Exactly. They were pragmatic about their collaboration.
But how did they deal with those disagreements? Did they have some kind of formal process for conflict resolution?
You know, I haven't come across anything about a formal process, but it seems like there is a shared understanding that the bigger picture, ending the war, fighting for racial justice, was more important than their differences.
It's like choosing your battles, right? Knowing when to stand firm and when to compromise to keep moving forward.
Exactly. And that's a valuable lesson in coalition building. Sometimes you got to put aside those smaller disagreements to focus on the bigger goals.
It's a reminder that compromise doesn't mean abandoning your principles. Sometimes it's just about strategy.
Well said. It's about being smart and effective. And the Panthers, they were definitely strategic in their alliances.
Okay, so SDS is one example. But what about a more extreme case? Like the Panthers' relationship with the Weather Underground. Now, they were a whole different story.
The Weather Underground, definitely on the fringe. They were known for their more radical and controversial tactics, like bombings.
Yeah, they definitely weren't afraid to take things to the next level. But how did the Panthers reconcile that with their own beliefs?
It's a tricky one. But even with those drastic differences in approach, they still shared a common enemy, the U.S. government.
So even though the Panthers didn't condone their violence, they still saw the Weather Underground as allies in that bigger fight against the system.
It really makes you think about where you draw the line in terms of allyship, right?
Right. Because at what point does supporting a group's actions contradict your own values? It's a real ethical dilemma.
No easy answers there. But what we can learn from the Panthers is that building effective coalitions often requires navigating those difficult choices.
It's about finding that balance between staying true to your principles and recognizing the power of solidarity.
And that's a balancing act that activists are still grappling with today.
This whole deep dive has been mind-blowing. We've seen how the Panthers built this incredible network, how these alliances worked in real life, and the challenges and triumphs they faced along the way.
It's complex and messy, but it's also incredibly inspiring.
For real. It shows what's possible when people come together, despite their differences, to fight for a common cause.
And those lessons are more relevant than ever. We're facing so many challenges today. Climate change, economic inequality, the rise of authoritarianism. We need to learn from the past, from groups like the Panthers and their allies, to build those bridges of solidarity that can bring us together to fight for a better future.
You know, the next time I find myself debating whether to collaborate with a group that I might not agree with on everything, I'm going to think of the Black Panthers.
Me too.
Right.
They were masters at building alliances, even when it meant making tough choices.
So deep divers, remember the Panthers and their allies. And remember that the fight for a more just and equitable world demands that we learn to handle complexity, find that common ground, and recognize that we're stronger together than we are alone.
Well said. On that note, I think it's time to wrap up this deep dive into the allies of the Black Panther Party.
We hope you found it insightful, and as always, keep those minds curious and those hearts open. We'll see you next time. Deep divers.
Awesome.